Hello and welcome to Death Drive Dialectics. Today we're discussing a concept known as necropolitics, created by Achille Mbembe to analyze the role death and violence plays in state power and the political economy of global capitalism. Necropolitics is an especially important mode of analysis in our world, which is plagued by increasing austerity, underdevelopment, racial inequality, hateful sectarian violence, terrorism, fascism, ultranationalism, in short, the erosion of democratic rights, so-called enlightenment values, and humanist freedoms. Mbembe says himself that the most accomplished form of necropower is the contemporary colonial occupation of Palestine. He also says paradigmatic of this matrix of rule, or necropolitics, is present-day Gaza in Palestine. So we'll start there.
I think in order to understand the necropolitics of what's happening in Gaza, it's important to understand Israel's campaign of genocide. This is one of the core tenets of the Genocide Convention, the bringing about of conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of life in whole or in part of a population. And this is exactly what Israel has done in the Gaza Strip, where it has systemically attacked the food production sites, the water infrastructure, the sewage infrastructure, the hospital infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure. Another example that is really important to understand is the politicization of starvation and the use of starvation as a weapon of war. This is a particularly necropolitical weapon, with Israel, quote unquote, putting Gaza on a diet, restricting the calorie count of the entire strip so as to keep people in conditions very close to starvation. And then when the attack happened, putting them directly into starvation. And in the West Bank, Israel has also been very aggressive in a necropolitical agenda, primarily focusing on apartheid and territorial fragmentations, checkpoints, fences, Jim Crow infrastructure, separate roads, separate health institutions, separate villages that divide Palestinians, restrict their movement, restrict their access to political, economic, and human rights.
A good quote for this is, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank is a splintering occupation, in keeping with the splintering urbanism characteristic of late modernity, suburban enclaves or gated communities.
Yeah, and you can see this segregated development and intentional underdevelopment, where Israeli communities and settlements have access to total infrastructure development, where it's basically like a Southern California suburb right next to an intentionally underdeveloped ghetto where services are intentionally cut off, where settler violence goes unpunished, and so many more indignities, the daily threats of violence perpetrated by both soldiers, police, military, and settlers.
Related to this, what you're saying, Nick, is that violence isn't just the shedding of blood, but, as Achille Mbembe states, is the reduction of the human to an undead state. And I think starvation is probably as close as you can get to being an undead zombie. In addition to the destruction of the capacity to live that Nick is talking about, we also have other factors at play, like surveillance, a highly technological regime of control that Israel has implemented over Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank.
It's the most surveilled place in the world. Cameras and mass surveillance infrastructure try to track every possible movement of Palestinians throughout the territory. And this is paired up with armies of drones and algorithms that make calculations on the killing of Palestinians. This is a terrifying new concept in the modern politics of death that is part of this thing that Mbembe is talking about when he's talking about necropolitics.
And another point I wanted to mention is that what we're describing here is not just contained to the past 2 years, but has been going on for decades. What precedes the genocide is a long history of reducing a population to an undead state, of surveillance, of violence, of starvation, and racialization. if you are to call it a war, it's a war on a population. It's a war on people. It's a war on life. Key to this as well is maybe something we should talk about for a little bit is the ideological component of this occupation that's necessary for committing this violence, which is the racialization of the other. And as we'll see, racialization or dehumanization is just as much as the technologies of violence and the weapons is integral to necropolitics. We're talking about this from a very high level right now, almost dispassionately, but I don't want to give that sense. It's equally as important to recognize the ubiquitous and persistent humiliation and reduction to like a body that Palestinians experience, and to live in that state outside the starvation and the violence, just like on an affective level, on an emotional level, is being undead. I think in general in the Western world, there's this incredulity, this confusion as to how something like this, a genocide, can exist in quote unquote the only democracy in the Middle East, which of course is inaccurate. But I think there's an ironic truth, and Mbembe would make this point too, that there is something about democracy and modernism that lends itself to this kind of violence. We started with Palestine and the West Bank because it is the apogee, the climax of necropolitical power and violence. Necropolitics, this capacity for violence, is not anomalous. It's not anachronistic. It's not antithetical to the liberal democratic world order. Understanding the debased genocide in Gaza means understanding that genocide, racism, is itself a modern phenomenon that, along with the state and international law, citizenship, equality, liberalism, along with that comes the exception to these things and a new and modern capacity for almost like apocalyptic violence. Mbembe's Necropolitics is an attempt to define this exception and to lay out how sovereignty or the state has grown violently dependent on these perpetual wars and creations of spaces of exception. We're going to get into where this all started, right, Nick?
Yeah. Mbembe's concept of necropolitics is an extension of Foucault's concept of biopolitics. And Foucault talks about biopolitics and technologies of power that manage the life and death of a society, of a state, of a population. Mbembe's necropolitics focuses particularly on the colonial dimensions of biopower and biopolitics, and on the exercise of death and the creation of death worlds, war machines, and genocide. But in order to understand that, we have to understand modern sovereignty and its development during the so-called Enlightenment. States during the colonial period accrued tremendous wealth from the slaughter of Black, brown people, of the people of oppressed nations. At the same time, they're developing bourgeois democracy and are articulating concepts of universal human rights, that people, by virtue of being born, are endowed with a certain set of political, human, economic, social rights that they can exercise. And they come into a contradiction between the profitability of enslavement, conquest, and occupation, and the values that they want to uphold for themselves. The laws in which they would like to be judged under and the rights in which they would like to hold are in contradiction with their colonial position. And so out of this contradiction comes the development of race and the racial other. That in order to resolve this contradiction, that all men are created equal, some of these people must not be men, must not be fully endowed with the rational capacities, with the genetic predispositions, with the national character. And so this is how enslavement is justified, how the colonial Bantustan is justified, and how the social construction of racecraft comes into being, is through this necropolitics and this necropolitical contradiction.
Very, very well said. Race came in as a answer to this contradiction between the necessary violence of capitalism, primitive accumulation, and the democratic rights or humanism, which became the dominating ideology of the time. Whiteness itself was created around this time to allow for the collaboration between Western nations and for the effective removal of the indigenous populations in the Americas. A quote from Mbembe here is that any historical account of the rise of modern terror needs to address slavery, which could be considered one of the first instances of biopolitical experimentation. In many respects, the very structure of the plantation system and its consequences express the emblematic and paradoxical figure of the state of exception. Let's return to this idea of a state of exception as it relates to settler colonialism and slavery, Nick.
Necropolitics and the exercise of the power to kill people in liberal democratic states requires states of exception that circumvent the laws which the state upholds for itself. You see this in the plantation, and you see this in the concentration camp. Mbembe talks about how the technologies that produced Nazism originated in the plantation and in the colony. These states of exception are how states justify genocide, by creating people outside of the law, by creating places outside of the law, where they can create the living dead, where they can create death worlds.
I think it'd be worth getting into briefly an example here. One of the most demonstrative manifestations of this state of exception is like the Wild West, or the frontier of the United States. It was literally called like a lawless land. It was a state of lawlessness. And the point here that Mbembe makes, or would make, is that this lawlessness is not incidental, is not coincidental. The lawlessness of the West is what allowed for the removal of Indians, alongside the organization of laws that was happening more on the East Coast. That lawlessness is a necessary tool for the further development of capitalism alongside democracy.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to highlight that necropolitics don't end at the end of the frontier, that as the frontier crosses people, those people wind up in slums, in townships, in Bantustans, in allotted reservations, in colonial ghettos that lead to deaths of despair and indifference.
We go through history, we have the Black as the other, we have the Native American as the other. Once these contradictions become too much, slavery is abolished. We've already expanded to the West Coast. Native Americans are sort of a non-problem at this point. The state requires, as Mbembe lays out, a continual creation of another. We have throughout history of the modern world perpetual engineering of a racial other, an ethnic other, a religious other, which is integral to the operation of democratic capitalism. No, I was going to say that same contradiction that you brought up in the very beginning between the violence necessary for the continuation of capital, of accumulation, and liberal democratic values has not gone away. In the 1930s, post-war, 1940s, 50s, this contradiction was at its most controlled or contained through the creation of the social welfare state. Capitalism was invested in creating social value and social wealth. But we find that as history progresses, especially as capitalism begins to win out over communism, capitalism begins to decouple itself from this investment in social wealth. And this is what describes neoliberalism, a resurgence of this contradiction between democratic values and capitalist exploitation. We have to talk about deindustrialization, financialization, the erosion of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the stepping away from the gold standard.
Yeah, neoliberalism is a system of market domination, by multinational monopoly capitalist corporations that privatize wealth, accumulate wealth for the elite, the bourgeoisie, the generalized objectification of human beings the turning of all people into numbers, into data. This marks the neoliberal era as we understand it.
One of Mbembe's quotes: under neoliberalism, nothing henceforth is inviolable, nothing is inalienable, and nothing is imprescriptible, except perhaps property still. So we find that capitalism is becoming less and less interested in human rights, is willing to prescribe programs of austerity, is willing to reduce social welfare, is willing to throw human dignity into the bin for the sake of these abstract markets and accumulation. The civilizational processes of the social welfare state, of democratic liberalism, operated to temper capitalists' violent drives, made a distinction between things that are sacred, like human rights, and things that are exchangeable, like commodities. This distinction is going away under neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Subjects are more predisposed to becoming objects, priceable, to becoming expendable.
I think, to put it simply, neoliberalism is capitalism unleashed by the state. Capitalism that is deregulated, where private industry and greed dominate the decision-making process of governments. And under this circumstances, a particular regime of necropolitics comes into being, one that is dominated by data, by neo-colonial institutions that are meant to sap the resources and to exploit the labor of colonized people or formerly colonized people. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that set out predatory loans to developing nations and underdevelops these nations for the profit, mostly of Western corporations. Neoliberalism is a part of the disintegration of communism, is part of the ending of the third world non-aligned political movement as a movement for independent development and political and economic sovereignty. Under these conditions, expendability and sacrifice zones and spaces where the markets dump their excess waste are necropolitical sites. Labor is hyper exploited, where workers exist without rights in special economic zones, tailor built for hyper exploitation and for workers to lack the basic rights afforded to workers within colonial nations, within the beneficiaries of this plunder.
And I think what's so worrying about the contemporary moment, there's no longer a concern for hiding this exploitation, this dumping, as you're describing, this pollution, the regime changes, genocide. If anything, they're almost just outright lauded as just and right because the market says so. I think Mbembe's point about necropolitics, or one of his critical points, is that, where is this quote? That with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the advent of globalization, the fate of capitalism does not any longer depend structurally on liberal democracy. They are on a collision course, and we are well along the way toward their disentanglement. And we're talking a lot about the periphery right now in neocolonialism, but I think just as relevant is these technologies of necropolitical power returning home in the imperial core, where we're seeing a resurgence, as I said earlier, of racism, of anti-migration policy, of concentration camps where migrants are placed, a sort of naked violence that we're bearing witness to.
I think it's important to highlight the necropolitical dimensions of neoliberalism and neocolonialism, which exists on the border between the world that benefits from capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism, and the world that is being imperialized, dominated, and violently occupied. And this border zone is a zone of exception, is a zone outside of the law where people become stateless, where crossings are made risky, where people are forced into a horrible Hunger Games of trials and tribulations trying to cross borders because border walls push people towards risky crossings. This is a necropolitics. These externalized borders and these internalized borders, these checkpoints, the random stopping and surveillance of citizens. One thing that we haven't talked a lot about, but I think is important to highlight with necropolitics, the necropolitics of spaces, of concentration camps, of places like Guantanamo Bay, places like Abu Ghraib, Diego Garcia. People are taken, tortured, claimed to be terrorists, and subject to all sorts of human rights abuses where they exist outside of any legal framework.
Yeah, I think that that defines war in the contemporary era. The state has become totally free to create these states of exceptions wherever it sees fit. I mean, U.S. at any given moment can make anyone disappear without trial. The legal process, especially in periphery nations in the Middle East and South America, in Africa. Not only that, but I think you would wish that you were disappeared, but if you were the victim of this disappearance, because chances are you're going to get tortured. There is no limit to the suffering that the U.S. state can inflict on you without trial, without due process. It's something that we take for granted here. I mean, at least for me as a white male, but outside the U.S. and now, as we're seeing, even within the U.S., when it comes to migrants, there's this unlimited capacity exhibited by the state, exercised by the state, that allows for totally lawless violence and death.
And we're seeing this in Trump's CCOT prisons in El Salvador. We're seeing this in third country agreements that are sending people to countries with horrible human rights abuses, horrific incarceration systems. And all of this is necropolitics. And I think it's important to highlight this as a part of the necropolitical processes of neoliberalism.
I think the point is that if you're not scared, you have to acknowledge that this necropolitical creation of the other is almost nihilistic. It is self-destructive. Another other needs to exist, and while you might be farther down on the list, you're on the list.
To put it simply, you could be the person on the outside of the wall being treated that way. You could be the person whose papers are considered insufficient and are targeted for arbitrary detention and incarceration. That once a state of exception exists, it can be expanded to include you or your people. I think one thing that I really like about Mbembe's concept of necropolitics is it gives us something, a set of contradictions to oppose in our own politics. We should oppose the politics of death, the ways in which our states are trying to organize death to advance their own political ends, and recognize that we need to stand in solidarity with the people who have been made vulnerable to death by the necropolitics of our neoliberal society. That we need to stand with stateless people, refugees, with the people in concentration camps, with the people of the third world, with the people of Palestine, with the people who are being oppressed by these systems, because these systems can come to oppress us if they haven't already. Right. And to recognize that to break these systems, we have to stand together in solidarity.
Right. Another key point of when it comes to how one can resist necropolitics, it starts from a demystifying democracy and human rights, de-essentializing them, or to not take them for granted, right? I mean, Mbembe says himself that no democracy exists without its double, its nocturnal face. Democracy bears the colony within it. And to understand that human rights aren't granted to us, they are fought for. They are not this thing that we're born with. We are given them through the blood of others. And if you're not fighting for them, someone else is somewhere else in the world. And as soon as you recognize that, it becomes a lot easier to join the fight and to not take your rights and your freedoms for granted.
So in conclusion, if you're here at the end, I want to thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it if you could like, share, and subscribe. We are putting together a Patreon because we are consistently running into issues of censorship, of repression in terms of our content, or suppression, I should say, in terms of our content. It's a little bit of a Freudian slip there. I'm talking a lot about repression, but also with copyright infringement issues. And so we're trying to get a Patreon together to hopefully circumvent some of these problems and give people access to this philosophical, political, and economic content that we're doing. Check the show notes for details. Bye.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.